They found something inside a rock on Mars, and the full story has not reached most people yet. In July 2024, NASA's Perseverance rover was moving slowly through an ancient, dried river delta on a planet that has been silent for 3 billion years. The rover was inside a crater called Jezero, a place that planetary scientists had chosen as the landing site for one specific reason above all others. Billions of years ago, Jezero was a lake, a real lake filled with liquid water, fed by a river that flowed in from the west and deposited sediment in a fan-shaped delta that is still clearly visible from orbit today. Scientists chose Jezero because lakes preserve things. They trap sediment layer by layer, burying whatever sinks to the bottom, protecting it from the elements, locking it into the rock record for billions of years. If anything ever lived on Mars, a place like Jezero Crater is where the evidence would most likely survive. That was the reasoning. That was the hope. And in July 2024, after 3.5 years of crawling across Martian terrain, drilling rocks, caching samples, and building one of the most detailed geological portraits of another planet ever assembled, Perseverance found something that turned that hope into something far more serious. The rover stopped at a pale, light-colored rock sitting in the ancient delta sediments. It extended its drill arm pressed against the surface and extracted a core sample from deep inside the rock. The rock was named Chiava Falls, after a waterfall in the Grand Canyon, following the mission team's tradition of naming significant geological finds after water features on Earth. That naming tradition turned out to carry more meaning than usual this time, because what Perseverance found inside Chiava Falls was not just evidence of ancient water. It was something that nobody on the mission team, however experienced, however cautious, however trained in the careful and conservative language of peer-reviewed science, was fully prepared for. The instruments detected patterns inside the rock that looked biological, patterns that on Earth are produced by living organisms interacting with their mineral environment, patterns that, according to the scientists who analyzed the data and published their findings in the journal Science, are strikingly similar to what microbial life leaves behind when it grows in hydrothermal rock environments. The scientists used words they almost never use in official scientific communications, words that carry enormous weight and enormous consequence in planetary science. They called what they found inside Chiava Falls the most significant potential biosignature evidence ever collected on Mars, not just by Perseverance, not just from the current generation of Mars missions. Ever. In the entire 60-year history of humanity sending spacecraft to the Red Planet, this video is about what is actually inside that rock, what the science genuinely says when you read the paper rather than the headline, why this discovery is generating the most serious and intense scientific debate about Martian life in the history of space exploration, what the skeptics are arguing and why those arguments deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, and why the final answer to the question humanity has been asking for centuries about whether life has ever existed somewhere other than Earth may already be sitting sealed inside a titanium tube on the floor of Jezero Crater right now, waiting for someone to come and bring it home. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this story is not finished. It is unfolding in real time, and every development in it matters. Now let us start from the very beginning, because you cannot understand why Chiava Falls is so significant, why scientists who have spent their entire careers being conservative and careful about exactly this kind of claim are reacting the way they are reacting, without first understanding what Mars is today, what Mars was billions of years ago, and how vast and consequential the difference between those two realities actually is. Mars today is dead, and when scientists say that word about Mars, they do not mean it loosely or poetically or for dramatic effect. They mean it in the most precise and literal scientific sense available to them. The surface of Mars is one of the most hostile environments in the known solar system. The atmosphere is 95% carbon dioxide, and so extraordinarily thin that the atmospheric pressure at the Martian surface is less than 1% of what you feel standing on Earth at sea level. To give you a sense of what that means physically, the atmospheric pressure on Mars is roughly equivalent to the pressure you would experience if you were standing at an altitude of 35 kilometers above Earth's surface. No human has ever breathed air at that altitude. No commercial aircraft flies that high. It is the edge of space by most practical definitions. The average temperature across the planet is approximately minus 60 degrees Celsius, and that average conceals extremes that are even more brutal. At the poles during winter, temperatures drop to minus 125 degrees Celsius. Liquid water cannot exist on the open surface of Mars under these atmospheric conditions, because at Martian pressures, water transitions directly from solid ice to water vapor without passing through a liquid phase. The surface is continuously bombarded by ultraviolet radiation from the sun at intensities that are lethal to all known forms of life, radiation that penetrates to the ground unimpeded, because Mars lost its global magnetic field billions of years ago, and its remaining atmosphere is far too thin to absorb the incoming energy the way Earth's thick atmosphere and magnetosphere do. The soil itself is chemically oxidizing, meaning it contains compounds called perchlorates and reactive oxygen species that actively break down organic molecules rather than preserving them. If you placed a living bacterium from Earth on the surface of Mars today, it would be destroyed almost immediately by the simultaneous assault of radiation, cold, dryness, and chemical reactivity. Nothing known to science lives on the surface of Mars right now. The planet is a frozen, irradiated desert of rock that has been silent and biologically empty, at least at its surface and in all the environments we have been able to study for billions of years. Whatever Mars is now, it is a cemetery, a world where something happened long ago and then stopped. But what Mars was 3 to 4 billion years ago is a completely different story. And the evidence for that different story is not hidden or ambiguous or dependent on optimistic interpretation. It is written clearly and extensively across the entire surface of the planet in geological features that planetary scientists have been studying and documenting through decades of orbital observation and surface exploration. Mars once had a thick atmosphere, generated and maintained by volcanic outgassing over hundreds of millions of years, dense enough to trap solar heat and maintain surface temperatures above the freezing point of water across large regions of the planet. It had a global magnetic field generated by convection in its molten iron core, a field that deflected the solar wind and protected the surface from the radiation that now strips it bare. It had rivers, real rivers with sustained flow, cutting channels into the bedrock over long periods of time, forming valley networks that extend for hundreds of kilometers and show the unmistakable branching patterns of mature river drainage systems. Some of these ancient river channels on Mars are comparable in scale to large river systems on Earth. They were not carved by brief, catastrophic floods. They show the characteristics of sustained flow over thousands to potentially millions of years, implying a water cycle involving precipitation and runoff rather than just episodic volcanic melting events. Mars had lakes, multiple lakes in multiple locations that filled with water and held it for extended periods. The Curiosity rover has spent years driving through the sedimentary rock formations at the bottom of an ancient lake and gale crater, analyzing layers of mudstone that were deposited over millions of years at the bottom of that ancient body of water. Those rocks contain clay minerals that only form in neutral, chemically mild water, exactly the kind of water that life could have thrived in. Jezero crater, where Perseverance is operating, preserves evidence of a lake that may have been hundreds of meters deep and persisted for millions of years, fed by a river system that is still traceable across the Martian landscape from orbit. Mars may also have had a large ocean covering a significant portion of the northern hemisphere during its earliest and wettest period, an ocean with a surface area potentially comparable to the Arctic Ocean on Earth. The evidence for all of this comes from multiple independent lines of scientific inquiry. High-resolution orbital cameras have mapped ancient river valley networks across the surface in extraordinary detail. Mineral mapping spectrometers on Mars orbiters have identified clay minerals, sulfate minerals, and carbonate minerals across wide areas of the ancient Martian terrain, minerals that only form through prolonged chemical interaction with liquid water. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has identified ancient lake shorelines preserved in the topography of the northern lowlands. Surface rovers have driven through ancient lake beds and touched and analyzed the rocks that formed in them, rocks that are geochemically and structurally identical to lake sediments on Earth. Ground-penetrating radar instruments have mapped subsurface water ice layers and ancient sedimentary structures beneath the current Martian surface. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence, accumulated across decades of investigation by dozens of spacecraft and hundreds of scientists, is clear and consistent. Mars, during its first billion years, was a genuinely wet and potentially warm planet. Not just occasionally damp, not just wet in isolated spots for brief periods. A planet with a sustained water cycle, with rivers that flowed for millions of years, with lakes that persisted for millions of years, with an active hydrological system that distributed water across the surface and into the subsurface in ways that are reflected in the geology we can read today. A planet that was, by every scientific criterion, habitable. A planet where the conditions existed for life to start and survive. And on Earth, the relationship between liquid water and life is one of the most robust empirical observations in all of biology. Wherever liquid water exists on Earth, life exists, without exception, without qualification. This observation has held up through half a century of exploration of Earth's most extreme environments, environments that would have been dismissed to what biology produces. It was a convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, each pointing in the same direction, each individually explicable by non-biological processes, but collectively forming a picture that is very difficult to account for without invoking biology. The paper stated clearly that the features observed in Chayava Falls are consistent with a biological origin and represent the most significant potential biosignature evidence ever collected on Mars. It also stated, with equal clarity and honesty, that abiotic explanations cannot be ruled out with the data currently available. This is not a diplomatic hedge or scientific cowardice. It is the correct and responsible position to hold when the evidence is compelling, but the claim being considered is of the highest possible significance and irreversibility. You do not announce life on Mars, or even the strong probability of it, without a level of certainty that the available data does not yet provide. The consequences of being wrong for the credibility of planetary science and for the integrity of the institutions involved would be enormous. The scientific debate that erupted after the paper was published reflects the genuine difficulty and importance of the question. Some of the most experienced geobiologists and Mars scientists who engage with the Chayava Falls data argued publicly that the combination of features makes a biological origin more likely than any abiotic alternative. They pointed to the specificity of the pattern, the chemical consistency with what biology produces, and the overall geological context of the rock as collectively making a strong case. Others raised legitimate technical objections, noting that laboratory experiments have produced iron sulfate, patterns with spatial organization resembling the leopard spots through purely chemical processes, and arguing that without the ability to examine the sample at much higher resolution and with much more sensitive instrumentation, the case remains genuinely ambiguous rather than just cautiously stated. What every serious voice in this debate agreed on was that Chayava Falls is unlike anything previously found on Mars, that the features it contains demand the most rigorous follow-up investigation possible, and that the only path to a definitive answer runs through Mars sample return. Mars sample return is the mission concept that would bring the Chayava Falls sample and the other core samples Perseverance has collected back to Earth for analysis. The basic concept involves a future spacecraft delivering a Mars ascent vehicle to the Martian surface, retrieving the cached sample tubes from where Perseverance has deposited them, loading them into the ascent vehicle, launching that vehicle from the surface of Mars, a feat that has never been attempted, and transferring the samples to an Earth return orbiter that would carry them back across interplanetary space to Earth. The entire operation would be the most complex and technically demanding robotic space mission ever attempted by any space agency. It would require multiple spacecraft, international cooperation between NASA and the European Space Agency, and the successful execution of a chain of mission-critical operations in which any single failure could result in the loss of the most scientifically valuable samples ever collected. Once the samples reached Earth, they would be analyzed in specialized containment laboratories designed both to prevent any potential biological contamination of Earth's environment and to protect the samples from contamination that might compromise scientific analysis. Inside those laboratories, scientists would have access to instruments orders of magnitude more sensitive and capable than anything a rover can carry to Mars. They could look for cellular structures that environment appears by human standards. And the single thread that connects every extreme environment where life has been found, from the deepest ocean vents to the most irradiated Antarctic rocks, is the presence of liquid water, either now or at some point in the past. Ancient Mars had liquid water. It had it in abundance. It had it for hundreds of millions of years. It had it during exactly the same early period of solar system history when life was beginning on Earth, roughly 3.8 billion years ago. The hydrothermal systems that existed on early Mars, driven by volcanic heat and asteroid impacts, are systems that on Earth are not just habitable, but densely and productively inhabited by microbial communities. The lake and river environments that covered parts of the ancient Martian surface are environments that on Earth represent some of the most productive cradles of early life, the kinds of environments where Earth's fossil record preserves the earliest signs of biological activity. The chemical and physical conditions that existed on early Mars were not just compatible with life, they were, by every measure that astrobiology has developed, actively favorable for it. The question of whether Mars could have supported life has essentially been answered by the accumulated evidence of Mars exploration. The answer is yes. The conditions were right. The environments existed. The chemistry was appropriate. The timescales were sufficient. The question that remained open, the question that has driven the entire science of Mars astrobiology for decades, was whether life actually happened, whether chemistry actually crossed the threshold into biology, whether, given all those favorable conditions, something actually started living, reproducing, metabolizing, and leaving behind traces in the rock record that a rover could find 4 billion years later. Chayava Falls is the most serious attempt that planetary science has yet made to answer that question directly. And to understand what makes it so significant, you need to understand what the rover actually found inside it in specific and concrete terms, rather than in the generalities that most coverage of this story has settled for. The Sherlock instrument on Perseverance uses a technique called Raman spectroscopy, firing a laser at a sample and analyzing the light that bounces back to identify the chemical compounds present in rocks and soil at the molecular level without physically destroying the sample. Sherlock detected organic compounds inside the Chiava Falls core, carbon-containing molecules of the kind that form the chemical backbone of all biological structures. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, are organic compounds. Nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA, are organic compounds. The lipid that make up cell membranes are organic compounds. None of these specific molecules was identified inside Chiava Falls because Sherlock is not capable of that level of specificity in a rover-based instrument. But organic compounds of unspecified type were present inside the rock, and their presence was noted as one component of a larger picture. The more striking and scientifically significant features were the spatial patterns in the rock's mineral composition. When the imaging instruments on Perseverance examined the interior of the core sample, they revealed a pattern that immediately caught the attention of every scientist who looked at it. Distributed through the interior of the rock were irregular, roughly oval patches of reddish material, each one surrounded by a distinct and sharply defined white halo of different mineral composition. The reddish material contained iron compounds and phosphate minerals. The white halos were primarily calcium sulfate. The patches were scattered through the rock in an irregular but clearly patterned distribution, not randomly dispersed, but organized in a way that suggested a process working at a specific scale and in a specific mode. The science team called these features leopard spots, and the name captures both the visual appearance and, critically, the scientific significance. Because on Earth, this exact pattern, iron and phosphate concentrated in discrete spots surrounded by sulfate-rich halos distributed through rock in hydrothermal environments, is a recognized biosignature. Scientists have documented it in ancient terrestrial rocks from environments where microbial communities once lived near us are hydrothermal systems. They have documented it in rocks from currently active hydrothermal environments where microbial communities can be directly observed. And through decades of laboratory study, they have developed a detailed understanding of the biological mechanism that produces it. Microorganisms that metabolize iron compounds, oxidizing or reducing them to extract chemical energy, naturally concentrate iron and phosphate in ways that leave behind spatially organized chemical signatures in the surrounding rock. The sulfate halos form as a byproduct of the chemical reactions the organisms drive. The pattern is not random. It is biological in origin and biological in character, and experienced geobiologists recognize it as such when they see it in terrestrial rocks. The Chiava Falls rock shows this pattern. In a hydrothermal environment, in a rock that also contains organic compounds, in a rock whose mineral veins record the movement of liquid water through its interior billions of years ago, in a rock sitting in an ancient delta environment that was part of a habitable Martian lake system. When the scientists who wrote the science paper laid out the full suite of observations, the combination of features they were describing was not one unusual thing or two coincidental similarities to what biology produces. It was a convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, each pointing in the same direction, each individually explicable by non-biological processes, but collectively forming a picture that is very difficult to account for without invoking biology. The paper stated clearly that the features observed in Chiava Falls are consistent with a biological origin and represent the most significant potential biosignature evidence ever collected on Mars. It also stated, with equal clarity and honesty, that abiotic explanations cannot be ruled out with the data currently available. This is not a diplomatic hedge or scientific cowardice. It is the correct and responsible position to hold when the evidence is compelling, but the claim being considered is of the highest possible significance and irreversibility. You do not announce life on Mars, or even the strong probability of it, without a level of certainty that the available data does not yet provide. The consequences of being wrong for the credibility of planetary science and for the integrity of the institutions involved would be enormous. The scientific debate that erupted after the paper was published reflects the genuine difficulty and importance of the question. Some of the most experienced geobiologists and Mars scientists who engage with the Chiava Falls data argued publicly that the combination of features makes a biological origin more likely than any abiotic alternative. They pointed to the specificity of the pattern, the chemical consistency with what biology produces, and the overall geological context of the rock as collectively making a strong case. Others raised legitimate technical objections, noting that laboratory experiments have produced iron sulfate, patterns with spatial organization resembling the leopard spots through purely chemical processes, and arguing that without the ability to examine the sample at much higher resolution and with much more sensitive instrumentation, the case remains genuinely ambiguous rather than just cautiously stated. What every serious voice in this debate agreed on was that Chiava Falls is unlike anything previously found on Mars, that the features it contains demand the most rigorous follow-up investigation possible, and that the only path to a definitive answer runs through Mars sample return. Mars sample return is the mission concept that would bring the Chiava Falls sample and the other core samples Perseverance has collected back to Earth for analysis. The basic concept involves a future spacecraft delivering a Mars ascent vehicle to the Martian surface, retrieving the cached sample tubes from where Perseverance has deposited them, loading them into the ascent vehicle, launching that vehicle from the surface of Mars, a feat that has never been attempted, and transferring the samples to an Earth return orbiter that would carry them back across interplanetary space to Earth. The entire operation would be the most complex and technically demanding robotic space mission ever attempted by any space agency. It would require multiple spacecraft, international cooperation between NASA and the European Space Agency, and the successful execution of a chain of mission-critical operations in which any single failure could result in the loss of the most scientifically valuable samples ever collected. Once the samples reached Earth, they would be analyzed in specialized containment laboratories designed both to prevent any potential biological contamination of Earth's environment and to protect the samples from contamination that might compromise scientific analysis. Inside those laboratories, scientists would have access to instruments orders of magnitude more sensitive and capable than anything a rover can carry to Mars. They could look for cellular structures at the nanometer scale. They could perform isotopic analysis of the carbon in the organic compounds to determine whether the ratios of carbon isotopes match the pattern of biological fractionation or abiotic chemistry. Carbon isotopes are fractionated differently by biological processes than by abiotic ones, and the isotopic signature of carbon in ancient rocks is one of the most powerful tools available for determining whether organic material has a biological origin. They could examine the spatial arrangement of the leopard spot features at resolutions far below what Perseverance's instruments can achieve, potentially revealing structural details that would be diagnostic one way or the other. They could run every analytical technique that decades of biosignature science has developed against the same samples simultaneously. The Chiava Falls discovery has transformed the conversation around Mars sample return in a way that years of general scientific argument about the mission's importance never did. The abstract case for bringing Mars rocks home has become a concrete and urgent case centered on a specific rock, with specific features that specific scientists are publicly describing as the most important. Potential biosignature evidence ever found beyond Earth. Budget discussions and scheduling debates that seemed technical and remote when the argument for sample return was based on general principles of planetary science now feel different when there is a specific rock with a specific story waiting on the surface of Mars. The implications of a confirmed biological origin for the Chiava Falls features extend far beyond Mars science and far beyond planetary exploration. If life arose on Mars, roughly 4 billion years ago, at approximately the same time that life was arising on Earth, that coincidence carries a message about the nature of life itself that would reshape the foundations of biology, chemistry, and our understanding of our place in the universe. It would mean that life does not require a unique and unrepeatable configuration of cosmic accidents to emerge. It would mean that the emergence of life is not an extraordinarily improbable event that happened to occur once on one planet, in one solar system, in one galaxy. It would mean that, given liquid water, chemical energy, the right mineral environment, and enough time, life